Hi, I'm Carrie Kennedy. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to start the Under the Mask presentation with a story. 19 years ago, on a sunny morning, I was at Rikers Island. Rikers Island is a prison right outside New York City. I was about to do a workshop with youth in detention. And because I was in the prison, I was not at my office near the World Trade Center. My twin brother, however, was there. He was a commodities trader and always arrived bright and early, right before the market opened. His office was on the 85th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Where I was at Rikers Island, at 8:47, the prison went into lockdown mode. And I don't know if you've ever experienced a prison in lockdown mode, but it's very dramatic. The alarms went off, all the doors slammed to a close. We didn't know what happened, but we heard that an airplane had crashed into the North Tower. I knew my brother was in the North Tower. So I immediately tried to call him on the cell phone and I couldn't get through. I tried consistently, couldn't get through. A colleague who was a detective sped us across the Brooklyn Bridge minutes later. And the Brooklyn Bridge was closed for cars. So we were one of the only cars going in the direction of the World Trade Center. And around us, thousands of shocked people walked across that bridge covered in a white soot. As many of you know, it was a devastating day. Phone lines were jammed all morning, and it would be hours before I spoke to my father, who told me the news. The North Tower was the first building to be hit and the second to collapse. The plane crashed 8 floors above my brother's office. They actually saw the plane crash into the building. Kevin was a runner and a wrestler, and he listened to the confusion in the offices as people disputed whether to stay or to leave. At that time, they thought it was a small plane and were recommending that people stay. He decided to leave the building and ran down the steps. As a runner, he ran as fast as he could, and he stepped outside minutes before the building collapsed behind him. I'll show you a picture here. Okay, so this is Kevin, my twin brother, running as the building collapsed behind him and the debris pushed everything forward. He's alive today, thank goodness, but thousands are not. And we know that many, many more hundreds of thousands have died after 9/11 as a result of the subsequent wars. So this day was a thunderbolt moment for me. It was a day that I decided I was going to spend my life trying to understand what motivates violence. I went to graduate school immediately after, and then onto a career leading peace building and humanitarian operations and advocating for civic rights, promoting women in leadership. 19 years later, I'm here with you today serving as the Associate General Secretary for International Programs for the American Friends Service Committee, or otherwise known as AFSC. AFSC is a 103-year-old Quaker peace and social justice organization operating in 17 countries, including the United States. I want to tell another story about another day 19 years ago. So on another day, on another morning 19 years ago, Richard Reed attempted to ignite plastic explosives in his shoe. He was actually in Paris. He was on an American airline flight from Paris to Miami, and thankfully his attempt failed. But in response to his attempt, all passengers traveling in and out of the United States were and still are required to take off our shoes and run them through the security apparatus before boarding a plane. So 1 billion people per year travel in and out of the United States. That's obviously changed this year because of COVID, but in an average year, 1 billion people are traveling in and out of US hubs. 19 years later, after this one attempt, we still obediently take off our shoes every time we fly. So what does this have to do with Under the Mask? We know throughout history that governments have used crisis to introduce measures that would not be accepted otherwise without protest or outrage. Measures that can be enacted without scrutiny by the public and without a clear timeline that is linked to the emergency, whether an act of violence, as was the case in 9/11, or a public health crisis, as is the case with COVID-19. Governments are able to push through these measures that are long-lasting. In the case of of Richard Reed, 19 years later, we still take off our shoes and put them through security. Now, there may be a very good reason for us to do that. Perhaps there is intelligence that shares that this is still an active threat and that we should, in fact, do this before we get on an airplane. But that information is not shared with the public in a transparent way. So Under the Mask began so that we can look at and really examine restrictions under COVID and serve as a watchdog for those restrictions so that there's as much transparency as possible. I joined the American Friends Service Committee 8 years ago as the Associate General Secretary. Soon after I joined, AFSC, with the Friends Committee for National Legislation, developed a 50-year vision for a just foreign policy called shared security. Shared security is this paradigm for promoting the safety and well-being of people throughout the world based on our human understanding that shared problems require shared solutions. Essentially, it is this idea that your piece is my piece, and the understanding that peace and security are by their very nature indivisible. And this shared security vision has guided our work for the past 8 years. Never before has our safety and well-being depended so much on the safety and well-being of others. At the same time today, we're witnessing a global shift towards authoritarianism and an increase in the restriction of civic space over the past decade. And this has only become exacerbated by COVID-19. Since the first case of COVID-19 was identified 11 years ago, governments around the world have all worked to contain the spread of the virus to varying degrees, and some are using extreme measures. We at AFSC fully acknowledge the severity of the pandemic, and we believe that there's a need for governments to act swiftly to contain it for the public good. We also know, based on history, that in parallel, there is a need for organizations like ours and for the international community to identify, to monitor, and to resist the normalization of extreme measures that can be enacted, especially measures that can further restrict civic space or alienate marginalized people. And this, really, the 9/11 shoe example really exemplifies how something can be so normalized that it's not even questioned. And that's something that we really want to try to raise awareness about. So we launched a few AFSC staff people, including Sahar Vardi, who is our Israeli program manager, and I and some of our communication staff came together to say, what do we want to do? How do we want to monitor civic restrictions under COVID? And after some thought and conversation with partners, we launched this global project that includes online restriction mapping. We highlight other partners that are also doing restriction mapping, like ICNL and Civicus. We use AFSC stories and data. We host online virtual dialogues and trainings, and we share research, media, and tools for civil society. We're launching an online system that will go live in January, and we have been doing a lot of networking and dialoguing with our partners to find out what the global needs are. We've produced 4 reports, which you could find on Under the Mask at AFSC, and I'm going to share some of our key findings from those 4 projects, those 4 project reports and the dialogues that we had. So first, let me just pull up a picture here. Okay, that's a picture of somebody in Zimbabwe receiving aid, humanitarian aid that AFSC was providing. So our first finding is that, so we already talked about, his history shows us that governments use emergency periods to pass policies that are restrictive, policies that can be harmful. They also use the opportunity to pass policies that are unpopular but unrelated to the emergency. So it's a good time to sneak in some legislation or policy that you have been unable to move, but maybe will not be challenged in this moment. Our first finding is, yes, governments today are absolutely doing this on a local and national level. There have been extreme emergency measures implemented under the cover of responding to the virus. And some governments are capitalizing on this limited ability of civil society to organize and to mobilize. Restrictive emergency laws have impeded humanitarian aid, even when civil society has had the means to provide aid safely. And as most of us who have worked in and out of humanitarian spaces, typically there is humanitarian exemptions where civil society can go in and provide critical food, medicine, water, and personal protective equipment in this case. There has not been those exceptions made in many of the government lockdowns, and we know that many vulnerable people are suffering even more today with food security, with access to medical supplies, and it is this impediment of humanitarian space is also leading to the criminalization of aid workers. In Cameroon, an activist who was handing out personal protective equipment today faces 4 years in prison for trying to do humanitarian work. We also find that new laws are being enacted to restrict citizens' rights to protest and freedom of speech in places like Hong Kong. So if you would just bring up this picture, in one of our dialogues, we had a presenter who talked about Hong Kong and the extensive, prolonged protests that have been happening there. Under COVID, protests are now illegal and they are being criminalized. So it's an opportunity for governments to be able to crack down on political opposition. In the United States, where I am and where I'm from, the Trump administration has effectively shut down the asylum process completely in an unprecedented move. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about migration. In countries like Hungary and Indonesia, there has been new fake news laws that have been introduced that criminalize any critique of the government response. And even places where, even in Malaysia, for instance, free testing was offered to undocumented workers. And when the undocumented workers came for that free testing, they were arrested and penalized. So even public health mechanisms are being used for oppression. Second major finding is that the use of technology and technological surveillance is increasing under COVID-19. Well, you might think that's great. I mean, technology is wonderful. We can, do better contact tracing. We can figure out who infected people have gotten close to. And we are 100% in agreement that technology has very important uses. And on the flip side of that, because digital surveillance based on geolocation is so easy for states to use, it can help them trace the pandemic, see where people are. It does raise important questions of privacy. So once a restriction becomes normalized, once a population is tracked using some kind of geolocation measure, it can become normalized, like taking off our shoes in airports. And we want to make sure we're paying attention to this. That would give governments the opportunity to continue the restriction without oversight. We also found that in some places, like in Israel, our program manager, Sahar, reflected on increased surveillance in Israel and Palestine. And in Israel, and to a lesser extent, the Palestinian Authority, Palestinians are under surveillance much of the time, as well as visitors. And I will just pop up this picture if you haven't been to Gaza. This is a tunnel, where you're going in and out of your leaving Israel and you're entering Gaza. And there's technology and surveillance all over, monitoring movements. When you exit Gaza, you actually are talking to a camera when doors open. So technology is present in Israel already, and is being utilized in a way that is controlling Palestinians. And still, in March, Israel launched a mobile phone tracking technology to trace Israelis diagnosed with COVID-19. The Supreme Court, this had been challenged. There had been civil society protests around this, and the Supreme Court allowed this to continue as long as a parliamentary group oversaw the program. Palestinians and visitors entering Israel must download an app that allows the military to track their calls, their phone files, and many other Palestinians have downloaded that without realizing the access it gives to government. In Cambodia, foreign residents are required now to download an app that tracks all of their movements. So this is really unprecedented. It's taking us into territory where personal privacy is loosened under COVID. There may be cases where there's no longer a need to gain consent. In Hong Kong, the personal data protection laws were loosened, and now the government can track everybody's whereabouts by smartphone apps or electronic wristbands. And it's been successful and hasn't felt intrusive or excessive to the public when you're asking about that. At the same time, surveillance by the private sector went up, and people are much less vigilant about non-state surveillance. So there's a ton of data that's being collected by the state and by the private sector, which can be intimate, which can be beyond the scope of the global health crisis, and unfortunately can and has been used to target activists and to criminalize protesters. Lastly, there's a real concern about data breaches, how it's used and who has access to it. And we know there's tons of data breaches and security breaches and all over the world. And how can we ensure that this data is safe? A third finding from Under the Mask is around migration. So the dominant discourse today around migration tends to be that migration is a threat. And this narrative of migration as a threat is exacerbated under COVID-19. This is increasing border militarization and stigmatization. In Zimbabwe, refugees are being blamed for bringing COVID into the country. In the United States, racism towards Asian Americans have increased. In Costa Rica, there has been a 62% increase in xenophobia. So we also, as I mentioned before, let me just pull this slide up. As I mentioned before, in the United States, COVID has effectively ended the asylum process. And this is unprecedented. It breaks with decades of tradition. And what it means is that people who have come to the United States to apply for asylum now must remain in Mexico. And this is called the Migration Protection Protocol, or Remain in Mexico program. Mexico is now deemed a third safe country. However, Mexico doesn't have the resources to care for the safety and the food and the housing of all of the migrants who are stuck in limbo, waiting for our process to open up. In effect, what this ending of the asylum process and the Remain in Mexico program has done has been to shift the border down, to militarize the border between Mexico and Guatemala. And that also increases the spread of COVID, because people are left for months and years without information to understand how to continue their asylum process. And that picture was a picture in Mexico City, where I had traveled to Tijuana and Mexico City to visit with people who are stuck in shelters that look like big airport hangars, open air. The civil society is doing the best they can to care for migrants who are stuck there, but there's not space or the equipment to make sure they're social distanced or to make sure they're protected from COVID. And so this concern about migrant camps, about incarceration in detention centers and the spread of the virus is really real. Not only are host committees failing to allocate resources to migrant communities because they're prioritizing their own, but sometimes they're even worsening conditions. In Zimbabwe, the government has demolished houses in migrant communities, making shelter at home impossible. And we know in places like Jordan, the civil society does so much of the relief work for Syrian refugees, and when there's lockdown, movement is restricted. On this, lastly, we know that the over-militarization of the border is racialized. The United States during the pandemic increased troops on the southern border, but not the northern border with Canada, even though at that time there were far fewer cases in Mexico than in Canada. Mexico has increased its cases. So the last finding is that this is an opportunity. There's an opportunity globally for states to crack down on opposition voices. In the United States, many of you have watched as there were brutal crackdowns. There's a large movement calling for police reform and to police brutality, a call for Black Lives to Matter, and this all occurred around the epics of the George Floyd murder. So we see that protests are able to happen when people are wearing masks and are safe, but in many places there has been a very brutal crackdown, including the United States, on these safe protests. In Kenya, there's heavy-handed enforcement of extreme measures. Police has been charged with beating people, extorting money, by threatening people with quarantine and even murder. So to wrap up, in many ways, COVID-19 has illuminated the problems and the broken structures that exist in so many of our societies. And it's up to all of us here to address the repression, to build the world that we want to see, to build this world with shared security. To do that, we have to protect the space civil society needs to engage and address inequalities. So the Under the Mask body of work that we are showcasing here at the Paris Peace Forum presents our responses to these needs. We've developed an array of activities, webinars, networking opportunities, and online resources designed to inform. So we think that an active civil society is essential to a healthy culture. And we hope that you join us in our effort to monitor, track, and support civil society to make sure that emergency measures are time-bound, relevant, and transparent. With that, I thank you so much for being here. And, you know, there's a chat. I would love to hear any questions, and I would love to hear if you are seeing and experiencing any restriction in your country. Maybe you want to share that on the chat and see if there's any questions. I do believe that there's an opportunity with COVID-19, that we have an opportunity to build this holistic response that addresses the needs that responds to it, and that we together can build a space where civil society can thrive and address community issues. Thank you so much. Please join us at Under the Mask Online to get information, to hold your government accountable, and to track our civic rights. Did you mobilize during the presidential election? Yes, my scope of work, is international, but we did mobilize. We're continuing to watch the U.S. elections and to be ready to do any mediation or civil action that we might need if we do not see a safe and timely transfer of power. So we have been actively monitoring that. And yes, we do believe the pandemic reinforced racial inequalities in the United States. We've seen an increase in Asian American discrimination, and we have also seen that there's been a disproportionate response to Black communities with voter suppression, with police brutality, and that's something that our community partners are tracking, and we're very carefully paying attention to. Did we face some? Yes. So we haven't yet. We've done surveys where we're not verifying data through our restriction mapping. And this is one of the reasons why we're building out this tracking system so slowly, because we're being very careful not to harm, not to cause any harm to people that are participating with us. And anybody here that wants to talk about share restrictions that they are facing in their country? I can't see the chat that you see in your room. I am getting questions though. Yeah, and I do the same. Yeah, I do think I do think that the pandemic has reinforced structural inequalities in the United States, racial, economic, class. And this is something, this has been a crazy week. I'm sure you know, for many of us in the United States, and we are feeling that that it's demonstrating the brokenness of our society, and that we are going to have to spend a lot of time to understand how to build a culture that's inclusive, that's cohesive, that addresses the divisions that we have, and that addresses the unequal treatment that has occurred around the world in terms of police response, in terms of voter suppression. So this is something that we, as international peace builders, are paying attention to in the United States. On another note, we do work on election violence prevention and have really taken the lessons that we learned overseas and applied them to the United States, and how we could protect election integrity in our country. Okay, so it looks like, do you work with other movements concerned with issues such as, yes, we do. So we do work in the United States. So I manage our international work, 16 countries overseas, and we have a US program. We have 36 locations in the United States. We have a partnership with Black Lives Matter, and many of our US-based colleagues have very strong collaborations with them. We do also, there's synergy with Black Lives Matter and Palestinian movements, and we are in partnership with organizations like Black Lives Matter, like the Poor People's Campaign, to fight for shared security, to fight for equity, and to fight for a better world. Okay, well, thank you for being here. Go to AFSC, go to Under the Mask, and you will see our 4 reports there. They're translated into 4 different languages, and the online tracking system will go live in January, but you'll see information about a series of dialogues, about resources. We have a podcast that's about to come live that is going to do a deep dive into Israel, Kenya, and Latin America. And so there is a lot of great information out there. I'm just getting the mark that I have 2 minutes left. So with that, I'll just end on this note. There's an opportunity with this global pandemic for us to push each other and our leaders to invest in global shared security that rejects policies based on a narrative of fear and military domination. We have to seek solutions that recognize in our interconnected world, security depends on ensuring all of us are safe, not a privileged few. So we have to create the conditions where people can enjoy their human rights and meet their basic needs instead of building more military apparatus. Again, in the next months, look for a 1-year report, look for a podcast series, and look for a new online tracker. Join us at Under the Mask to get this information, to join our dialogues, and to be in partnership to hold civil society, to help civil society hold governments accountable. And thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of this forum. And let's go just to this, show you this last slide. So thank you. Okay. Thank you so much.